A young Apple Store employee is rejected for not being good-looking, until a millionaire announces that she will be the new team leader. The cold lights of the Apple Store reflected off the impeccably polished glass, but nothing hid the look of contempt that swept across the room. Emily, in a simple uniform and a shy smile, was holding her service tablet when she heard the manager raise his voice in front of everyone. "You don't have the profile we're looking for here. Apple demands image, poise, appearance, and you clearly have none of those." Suppressed laughter erupted among colleagues and customers as she blushed, fighting back tears. She felt like she was naked before an unforgiving audience. Cell phones were discreetly raised, recording her embarrassment as if it were cheap entertainment. In a place that sold cutting-edge technology, she felt reduced to nothing, as if her dignity had been disconnected along with the battery of a discarded device. But the silence that gripped the store was broken seconds later by the calm, deep voice of a man no one expected to see there. Impeccable dark suit, piercing gaze, a presence that occupied every inch of the space. He walked up to Emily and, without even looking at the manager, announced before everyone, "Starting today, this young lady will be the new team leader, and not because you approved of her appearance, but because I chose her." Shock coursed through the room like electricity. The manager paled, the employees held their breath, and the customers looked at each other in sheer astonishment. No one knew it yet, but this man was no ordinary customer. He was a silent millionaire, majority shareholder of the very store chain that was now witnessing a spectacle of humiliation turned into a turnaround. The Manhattan morning dawned with the sky reflected in the glass windows of the skyscrapers, and in the heart of the busiest neighborhood, the Apple Store pulsated like a modern temple of technology. Inside, the atmosphere seemed choreographed. Employees in their impeccable uniforms practiced smiles and looks that mixed haste with superiority. Customers paraded between blonde wood tables where devices gleamed like sacred relics, and every touch, every click, seemed part of a silent spectacle. But for Emily, it wasn't a spectacle, it was survival. She didn't see the store as a glamorous stage, but as the only space that offered her a chance to pay her overdue rent and keep the small room she shared with her sister. Her steps were restrained, her posture withdrawn, as if apologizing for existing in an environment that celebrated perfection. The glances of some colleagues pierced her with irony, as if her simplicity were an aesthetic flaw. The manager, a man obsessed with status, observed every detail with eyes that evaluated more than performance. They judged appearance, manners, everything she couldn't change. For Emily, working there was like walking a tightrope. Any slip-up could be used against her, and everyone seemed eager for that moment. The sophisticated crowd that entered and left the store carried expensive bags, designer clothes, and gestures that displayed power. The very architecture of the place reinforced the idea of exclusivity, that there was no room for human flaws. And yet there she was, with her hair tied back simply, barely visible makeup, and an expression of someone who knew the hardships of life far beyond the glass walls. To each instruction she received, Emily responded with a soft yes, trying not to attract attention, as if she believed invisibility could be her salvation. But the truth was, that morning, invisible she would not be. Tension built silently, like a storm about to break. Some employees whispered, exchanging knowing glances, and the more attentive customers noticed the awkward atmosphere, but didn't understand. The manager, with his forced smile and voice dripping with arrogance, was just waiting for the right moment to assert his authority. Emily, unbeknownst to her, was about to be placed at the center of a cruel spectacle in which humiliation would serve as entertainment for some and a lesson for others. Fate was already working its tricks, and the store, with its cold and calculated atmosphere, became the stage for a story no one there would forget. Emily had never had the chance to choose her story. She had simply been born into a harsh plot that seemed written to test her every day. She grew up in a forgotten neighborhood on the outskirts of Newark, where the walls were too thin to contain the nighttime screams, and the streets, covered in trash, reflected the absence of hope. Her father had abandoned the family when she was just 6, taking with him not only their little money, but also her mother's trust in men. Her overwhelmed mother worked 3 jobs simultaneously, yet still couldn't put enough food on the table. Emily remembered nights when dinner consisted of stale bread dipped in watery milk, nights when she and her sister hugged each other to pretend their hunger was less than it actually was. At school, her classmates didn't forgive her plain appearance. Worn-out clothes, worn-out shoes, unkempt hair due to lack of time and resources. She carried invisible scars from every muffled laugh that singled her out as the poor girl, scars that shaped her silence and her attempt to become invisible. But within that silence, a strength was born, a flame that wouldn't let her give up. At 15, she got her first job at a diner, bussing tables and washing greasy dishes, while watching wealthy teenagers spend on a single meal what her mother had struggled to save for a whole week. It was there that Emily learned to smile even when she wanted to cry, to be grateful even when there was nothing to be grateful for, to endure small, constant humiliations with the dignity of someone carrying a greater secret that she wasn't born to stay there forever. Her mother's premature death, a victim of a breakdown caused by overwork, was the hardest blow. Emily and her sister, still teenagers, were left alone in the world, without an inheritance, without support, without a stable home. Every overdue bill was a threat, every month a battle for survival. She studied with borrowed books, took free online courses whenever possible, and found refuge from the internal noise of grief in public libraries. There was a quiet, almost military-like discipline about her that no one noticed at first glance, but which manifested itself in every effort. To others, she was just another dull young woman trying to occupy a space that didn't belong to her. But Emily carried the memory of every tear of her mother's, every cold night, every humiliation she'd endured. And this weight, far from destroying her, became her invisible armor. Behind her shy gaze and simple Apple Store uniform lurked a life forged in pain and abandonment, a life silently waiting for the moment when it all made sense, when the pain itself would become an answer. That morning the store was packed, a constant parade of suited executives, curious tourists, and young people fascinated by the glowing screens of iPhones. The manager, a man who made a point of being noticed, with an expensive watch glinting on his wrist and a strong perfume permeating the air, watched Emily as if seeking an opportunity to exert power. He never missed a chance to ridicule her in public, as if every word of contempt reinforced his own authority. Seeing Emily serve a customer with kindness and patience, he approached with a venomous smile. "You know what the problem is here," he said loudly enough to attract the attention of the other employees. "It's that some people think friendliness makes up for lack of appearance, but in this store we don't sell charity, we sell image." His colleagues, lined up in their impeccable uniforms, chuckled softly, complicit in the spectacle. One of them muttered, "She'd never have a chance in an Apple campaign," and the comment spread like poison, increasing the muffled laughter. Emily swallowed hard, her face burning, but she stood firm, clutching the tablet as if it were her invisible shield. The manager, fueled by the attentive gazes around her, then threw the spark that would ignite the moment. "Want to bet on how long she can last here? A week? 2 days? Let's see who wins. Whoever loses pays for dinner." The laughter was now open, echoing between the glass walls, mingling with the electronic sound of the devices vibrating in demonstration. It was more than a bet. It was a sentence. Emily was the target, the reason for the collective amusement, the human sacrifice offered on the altar of arrogance. Some customers, noticing the scene, glanced at each other in embarrassment but did nothing. As always, the silence of the majority sustained the abuse of the few. For Emily, each word fell like a stone on her dignity, crushing not only her confidence in her work, but all the effort of years of struggle to get there. She took a deep breath, trying not to cry, knowing that if a tear escaped, it would be confirmation of their victory. But inside her, an ancient voice, forged in the pain of childhood, said, "Resist, because they still don't know who you really are." The air inside the store felt heavier than ever, as if each glance were a sharp blade pressing against Emily's skin. The manager, still savoring the echo of the bet, approached her with a crooked smile, certain he had the audience in his hands. Emily breathed deeply, trying to cling to any shred of dignity she had left, when an unexpected presence changed the temperature of the room. His firm footsteps echoed across the smooth floor, different from the others. They were not hurried nor disoriented, but confident, marked, of someone accustomed to being heard without having to raise their voice. The man who entered did not seem ordinary. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his posture erect, and his eyes observed every detail with calculated coldness. Some employees immediately stopped their work, as if the sheer magnetism of his presence demanded silence. Emily, confused, instinctively lowered her gaze, but soon felt the weight of that attention focused on her. He didn't seem to be there to buy a cell phone, nor to test a new headset. He seemed to be there for a much more specific reason. The manager, noticing the figure, tried to regain control and ran over to him, his voice soft and falsely polite. "Welcome, sir. Can I help you with something special today? We have exclusive news that might interest you." The man ignored him as if he were just another ambient noise, looking away at Emily, who remained motionless, caught between fear and disbelief. The silence stretched until he finally spoke, his voice deep and calm, unhurried. "You're the one they humiliate here, aren't you?" The phrase sounded like a sentence, not a question. Emily looked up slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time, and felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something in his gaze that wasn't pity, but recognition. The manager, feeling the ground give way beneath his feet, tried to laugh it off, as if it were a misunderstanding. "Oh, sir, nothing like that. We were just joking with the staff, you know, to keep the atmosphere light." But the words sounded hollow, useless. The man took a few more steps until he stood before Emily, so close that she could see her own reflection in his dark eyes. He extended his hand not to shake, but as if offering a silent pact, and said clearly, "From today onward, you are no longer invisible." At that moment, the laughter ceased, the betting died down, and even the customers realized they were witnessing something far from ordinary. Emily, paralyzed, felt that moment mark the beginning of a change she could never have foreseen, and although she didn't yet understand why, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. The moment the man announced Emily's presence as something that should no longer be ignored could have been the beginning of an unexpected recognition, but the manager's wounded pride and the latent cruelty of his colleagues turned that moment into a silent battleground. The manager, red with rage and embarrassment, couldn't bear the thought of losing authority in front of everyone, especially with customers watching. So, in a desperate attempt to regain control, he raised his voice theatrically. "Sir, with all due respect, Apple values the impeccable image of its employees. And this girl," he gestured to Emily as if she were an object out of place, "doesn't fit the bill. Look at her plain hair, dull clothes, lackluster posture. How can she represent a brand that symbolizes innovation and sophistication?" The words fell like stones to the floor, reverberating among the attentive gazes. Some employees chuckled softly, emboldened by the spectacle, while others simply looked away, unable to confront the injustice. Emily, motionless, felt each syllable like a blow striking her in front of a crowd. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. She'd learned early on that tears before predators are like blood before wolves. An older customer, uncomfortable with the scene, tried to intervene. "I don't think it's necessary to expose anyone like that." But the manager ignored him, inflated by his own arrogance, and continued, "Actually, I was about to resolve this issue. The store deserves professionals who carry the aesthetic the brand demands. This young woman, unfortunately, doesn't meet the requirements. No matter how hard she tries, she'll never achieve the required appearance. It's embarrassing for us, and for the customers too." At that moment, an employee in the background with a cruel smile whispered loudly enough to be heard, "Maybe she's good for cleaning the appliances, but not for selling them." The collective laughter returned, this time more open, more aggressive, like a chorus that crushed her even further. Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Her breathing quickened, her hands trembled, but she remained erect, supported by a strength she couldn't quite grasp. The man watching her said nothing, just narrowed his eyes, as if recording every detail of the scene for later use. The public humiliation, complete and relentless, made Emily a target, but at the same time, it created a silent spark within her that no one noticed. The spark of someone who would not forget, who would not forgive, and who was about to become the centerpiece of a poetic justice no one imagined. Emily remained motionless, still feeling the throbbing wound of public humiliation, when she finally raised her face. Her eyes, until then teary and submissive, now shone with a silent firmness no one there had ever seen. The manager, believing he had ended the argument, was preparing to dismiss her once and for all, but was surprised by a calm, firm, and cutting voice. "I always knew I didn't fit the mold you idolize," Emily said, looking him straight in the eye, unafraid. The silence that spread through the store was different this time. It wasn't the silence of oppression, but of surprise. The man in the suit, observing every detail, seemed to contain a small smile, as if he finally saw the spark that had been waiting. Emily stepped forward, the customers attentive like an involuntary audience, and continued, "I've heard your comments since day one. Every joke, every scornful look, every bet made at my expense. I thought if I tried harder, maybe you'd see the value that's hidden in the window. But now I realize it was never about work, but about your need to feel bigger by putting others down." The manager tried to interrupt her with an impatient gesture, but she didn't stop. Her voice, still low, pierced the space with the force of a truth impossible to ignore. "What you never knew is that I saw you enter hours into the system that weren't yours but those of your colleagues. I was there when you closed the register with incorrect numbers, and I heard you tell a customer a problem was unsolvable just to push a more expensive device. I never said anything, because I've learned that in places like this those who speak the truth are punished, but I always knew." The manager froze, his face fluctuating between pale and flushed, while the other employees, previously complicit in his mockery, looked at each other in alarm. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her own courage, and concluded, "Whether I stay or leave doesn't matter. What matters is that from today onward, you can no longer pretend your cruelty is just a joke." Those words, spoken without a shout, without theatrics, were like invisible blades piercing the air. For the first time, it wasn't she who flinched from the stares, but the manager who avoided looking at the crowd. The millionaire watching remained silent, but in his gaze there was something clear. The revelation wasn't just about the abuse she'd suffered, but about the unexpected strength of this young woman, who knew much more than she let on. That night, after the scene in the store, the man in the suit, whose presence still echoed in everyone's mind, couldn't simply leave without seeking answers. Her name, Emily Carter, stuck in his memory like a riddle that needed to be solved. It wasn't just compassion. There was something in her gaze, something he'd seen before. Using his influence and connections, within hours he had access to her background. Cold files revealed a life of pain that contrasted sharply with the arrogance of those who despised her. He discovered that Emily wasn't just a hard-working young employee. She had grown up fatherless, lost her mother early, and was supporting her younger sister alone. But what surprised him most was her connection to her own world. Years ago, in a social program anonymously funded by her company, Emily had been one of the standout students, the one who studied late at the public libraries, taking advantage of every free course offered. In forgotten reports, her name appeared as an example of resilience, one of the few who truly seized the opportunity as a lifeline. What's more, he discovered that Emily had once written a letter of thanks to the fund that supported her neighborhood, a letter never answered, but which had remained archived. He read it carefully, and each word carried the weight of a lifetime. "I don't know who funds this program, but know that a girl who lost everything still believes in the future thanks to you." After finishing reading, the millionaire stood still, feeling a fissure open in his own arrogance. She wasn't just an employee humiliated before his eyes. She was someone who had indirectly been touched by his decisions, someone who should have been seen and recognized long before. The secret was there. Emily wasn't invisible. She wasn't unimportant. She was, in fact, a survivor shaped by circumstances that silently connected her to the very empire he had helped build, and the realization struck him as a bitter revelation. While he lived in glass mansions, Someone to whom he owed gratitude was still struggling alone against the world's contempt and indifference. The day after that revelation, Emily didn't show up at the store. No message, no explanation, just the emptiness of her absence. Her colleagues, who until then had been amused by her humiliation, whispered maliciously that she'd probably given up, that she'd hidden out of shame. The manager, satisfied, treated it as a victory. "Problem solved," he'd say, flashing a victorious smile. But for the man in the suit, that silence was unbearable. He already knew more about her than anyone else there, and precisely because of that, her absence weighed even more heavily. For days, he discreetly returned to the store, but couldn't find her. He began asking contacts, searching for records, as if needing to decipher the enigma of where Emily could have gone. The longer he didn't see her, the stronger her presence grew within him, like an echo. In between meetings in glass skyscrapers, at lavish dinners with executives and politicians, her memory flashed through his mind. Her silent courage, her steady eyes that faced humiliation without crying out. The letter forgotten in a file. He began to realize he'd spent his entire life surrounded by people who fawned over their power, but never by someone who with so little revealed so much. As Emily faded into the city's shadows, he felt a void that no amount of money could fill. The store, once a stage for a spectacle, now seemed cold, lifeless, devoid of the human contrast she brought. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling everything with a phone call, was discovering what it meant to have no power over something that truly mattered. And it was precisely this absence that began to transform him. Emily's absence began to weigh, not only on him, but on the very empire he had built. The story of the humiliation at the store, discreetly filmed on customers' cell phones, leaked to social media days later. The video showed every detail: the manager exposing Emily, the laughter of his colleagues, and the silent figure of the millionaire watching closely. The images quickly went viral, garnering headlines and heated debates. "The Apple store that rejects the poor," some headlines read. "When appearance is worth more than character," others commented. His name, until then kept to a respected sphere, appeared between the lines. As the majority shareholder, there was no way to disassociate himself from the scene. Questions began to surface at press conferences, business meetings, even at social dinners where he had previously been celebrated. He, accustomed to controlling narratives, found himself in the uncomfortable position of being a defendant before public opinion. Some investors backed away, fearing damage to their image. Others demanded immediate management changes. To make matters worse, the manager, instead of taking responsibility, tried to shift the blame onto the culture of demands imposed by the owners, making it clear that the arrogance of the scene was a reflection of a higher-mindedness. And suddenly the spotlight turned on him. Newspapers plastered his face with words like elitism and disconnection. On social media, thousands demanded an answer. Where was the girl? What had happened to her? Emily's silence had become an accusation. Her every absence was like an arrow shot at him. The city that once revered him now judged him coldly. In the marble corridors of corporate buildings, he walked, feeling sidelong glances, whispers that could no longer be hidden. He discovered that power, when stained by injustice, is as fragile as glass. All it takes is a crack for everyone to point and turn away. And for the first time in a long time, he felt small, vulnerable, exposed. The millionaire who had everything now faced the weight of a silent but relentless judgment, the judgment of society, which is unforgiving when the truth comes to light. The weight of public opinion fell upon him like a hammer, but it was Emily's silence that became his greatest condemnation. Every meeting he was confronted at, every headline that splashed his image, reminded him of her firm expression, of the courage she had had to speak out in the face of humiliation. The millionaire, accustomed to resolving crises with checks and lawyers, realized that this time no amount of money could restore what had been lost. It was something deeper, intangible, beyond reach of money. On sleepless nights in his glass-enclosed penthouse, sitting overlooking the city skyline, he revisited his own trajectory. He remembered the ambitious young man he had once been, full of dreams, before power hardened him. He wondered at what point he had become blind to human worth, at what point he had begun to measure people by their appearance rather than the strength of their stories. Emily was the mirror that revealed this flaw, and the more he thought about her, the more he felt his entire empire was meaningless. The memory of the letter she had written years before, found in forgotten archives, haunted him. "I still believe in the future thanks to you." Words that, ironically, came from the same young woman now crushed by the indifference of the structure he supported, and it was in this paradox that his transformation was born. He began discreetly visiting poor neighborhoods, walking streets he'd never set foot on, trying to see the reality Emily had lived. He talked to young people, heard stories that would never make headlines, observed the sparkle in the eyes of those who carried nothing but hope. Each experience corroded him and at the same time liberated him. He understood that real power lay not in domination, but in recognition. The lavish dinners, once filled with talk of mergers and profits, became unbearable. He sought something that had never been there: authenticity. For the first time in decades, he began to rethink his own choices, not as a businessman, but as a man. And at the center of it all, always the memory of her. Emily wasn't just the humiliated employee, she was the catalyst for his redemption. The millionaire who once merely accumulated now learned what it meant to lose. Their reunion didn't take place in a luxurious ballroom, nor in a glass-enclosed conference room, but in an unlikely place, where simplicity spoke louder than any ostentation. He met her by chance in a community library in Newark, the same neighborhood where she had grown up, a quiet space lit by yellowish bulbs and filled with children leafing through books as if they were treasures. Emily was there, sitting at a simple table, surrounded by scribbled notebooks and young volunteers who seemed to be listening attentively. She wasn't wearing a uniform, nor did she carry the shyness of the Apple Store. She was different. Her expression conveyed calm, strength, and a strange freedom, like someone with nothing left to prove. He paused in the doorway, watching for a few moments unnoticed, feeling that this was the portrait of the woman who haunted him in memories and silence. When he finally approached, Emily looked up and recognized him immediately. There was no exaggerated surprise, no drama, just a direct, serene gaze that said more than words could. The millionaire, accustomed to being revered, for the first time didn't know what to say. "I looked for you," he confessed, his voice lower than ever before. She didn't smile, nor did she show anger. She simply closed the notebook in front of her and replied, "I know, but I wasn't lost." The weight of those words fell on him like a sentence. Emily hadn't needed him to get up. She had already found purpose amidst her pain, and her disappearance wasn't an escape, but a choice. He tried to justify himself, to speak of his searches, of his transformation, but she interrupted him gently. "It's not about you finding me, it's about you finding yourself." The silence between them was intense, charged with memories and the invisible scar they shared. He saw her now not as the humiliated young woman in the store, but as the woman who represented everything his wealth couldn't buy: dignity, courage, and truth. And in that reunion, marked by the simplicity of the place and the grandeur of what was, left unsaid, the millionaire realized that the true distance between them was not in the streets of Manhattan or the walls of power, but in the choice Emily would make next. Whether or not there was room in her life to forgive, or if her story would end there with a silent goodbye. The air inside the library seemed to hold its breath along with them. Children laughed in the background, flipping through pages, but between Emily and the millionaire there was only silence, thick and unbreakable. He, for once, wasn't surrounded by lawyers, reporters, or sycophants. He stood before her, vulnerable, a man who had built an empire but now seemed small. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, as if searching for strength within herself, and when she opened them, there was an almost cruel clarity in her gaze. "What did you come here expecting? A pardon to clear your conscience, or a second chance to make amends?" He tried to speak, but she held up her hand, stopping him. "For years, I believed that being invisible was my protection. But when you showed up at the store, I realized that invisibility is also a prison. You saw me, and that changed something in me. But what came next? The humiliation, the scorn, the laughter, all of it wasn't just about me. It was about the system you helped sustain. The millionaire lowered his eyes, swallowing his own shame as she continued. I could hate you, and maybe part of me still does, but carrying that weight wouldn't set me free. Forgiveness, however, doesn't mean I'll walk beside you again. It just means I choose to move on without carrying the shadow of what they did to me. His heart sank. He'd never feared losing contracts, companies, or fortunes, but losing the possibility of having Emily in his life felt like the hardest blow. She sighed and concluded, I won't hate you, but I won't be trapped in your world either. My place is here, with these children, with these people who still believe they can dream even with nothing. I'll move on with my life. You must move on with yours. And if you've truly changed, may your power no longer be used to humiliate, but to lift up those who no one sees. She stood, took the notebook, and said goodbye with a simple, almost fraternal, but definitive wave. He sat motionless, feeling he had just lost something all the money in the world could never buy. Forgiveness came, but not the reunion he had dreamed of. And in that silent choice, Emily sealed poetic justice, her freedom, and his loneliness. The cold Manhattan wind cut through the sign-lit streets, while the city continued its indifferent pace. Emily walked alone, her simple coat flapping, and in her hand she carried only an old notebook, as if it were her only inheritance. She stopped in front of the immense window of the Apple store, now crowded with new employees laughing and serving customers as if nothing had happened. For a moment, she watched from outside, seeing her own reflection in the glass, and there was no sadness in her gaze, only a strange calm, the serenity of someone who no longer needed approval. Across the city, at the top of a skyscraper, the millionaire sat in front of the glass wall of his penthouse, gazing at the skyline, seeing no skyscrapers, only the void between them. On the table beside him lay Emily's letter, yellowed with age, its words underlined in pencil as if they were open wounds. He reread it in silence, but this time without tears, only with the weight of an absence that nothing could fill. In the distance, a traffic light flashed red, reflecting off the window, painting it the color of an eternal wound. Emily continued walking, disappearing into the city lights, anonymous as ever, but now free. He stood still, a prisoner of what he could never regain. No words were spoken. Justice was served in the silence. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below, I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.